Tonight, a woman is sentenced up to 57 years in prison for beating a 3-year-old boy to death. 25-year-old Nadera Batson was.
The paramedics know the difference between a fall and a beating. When they climbed the narrow stairs of a West Philadelphia boarding house in June 2011, they find 3-year-old Jaquin Bruton on the floor of a cramped room, wearing only a diaper, skin marked with burns and bruises in different stages of healing. His godmother, 23-year-old Nadera Batson, says he fell down the stairs. Her boyfriend, Marcus King, stands nearby. The child is not breathing. In the months leading up to his death, Jaquin Bruton had been placed in the care of his godmother, a woman chosen by his family to provide stability during a difficult time. Nadera Batson presented herself as a solution when Jaquin's mother became homeless and entered a shelter. On paper, she was the conscientious friend, taking in a developmentally disabled child who needed extra care. Behind closed doors, she was something else entirely. While the outside world saw a young woman stepping up to help a family in crisis, the reality within that boarding house room was a calculated cruelty that would eventually shock even veteran detectives. Jaquin was born in Philadelphia in 2008. His early life was marked by instability and the challenges of developmental delays that required specialized attention. Medical records would later show that he needed more support than many children his age, a fact that made him both more vulnerable and more demanding as a dependent. When housing insecurity hit his mother in late 2010, the informal arrangement with Batson seemed like a blessing. Jaquin moved into the cramped boarding house room on Chestnut Street that Batson shared with her boyfriend, Marcus King. What followed was not the care his family expected, but a systematic dismantling of a child's body and spirit. The arrangement that was meant to be temporary extended into months, with the abuse escalating as Batson's control over the situation solidified. Between late 2010 and June 2011, neighbors in the boarding house heard what they would later describe as constant whipping sounds and the child's screams that went on and on. Medical evidence would eventually reveal that Jaquin's final months were filled with calculated torture. Batson beat him regularly, often daily, according to later testimony. King participated as well, though he would later claim Batson was the primary aggressor. The medical examiner documented bruises and fractures in various stages of healing, suggesting ongoing abuse over an extended period. Most disturbing were the burns, injuries from hot water, and even a blowtorch. His tiny body became a map of deliberate cruelty, with new injuries overlapping ones that were still healing. Forensic pathologists noted that the pattern indicated not just rage or momentary loss of control, but systematic abuse carried out over time. Some injuries appeared to have been inflicted days or weeks before others, creating a timeline of suffering written in scar tissue and broken bones. By spring 2011, the pattern had intensified. Neighbors had grown accustomed to the rhythm of abuse through the thin walls of the boarding house. Some later testified they had considered calling authorities but feared becoming involved or didn't want to lose their own housing. The medical examiner would later document broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a lacerated pancreas, the kind of injury associated with high-impact trauma, not a toddler's accidental fall. Burns on his feet and legs told a story of deliberate torture. The final injuries that ended his life included massive internal trauma that medical experts testified could not possibly have resulted from falling downstairs. One physician would later testify that the injuries were among the worst he had seen in his career, comparable to what might be expected from a high-speed car accident rather than household mishaps. On June 29, 2011, emergency services responded to a call at the boarding house. They found Jaquin unresponsive, with Batson claiming he had fallen down the stairs, the same excuse countless abusers have used when the evidence of their violence becomes impossible to hide. Paramedics resuscitated him long enough to get him to the hospital, where he died shortly afterward. Doctors immediately recognized the signs of prolonged abuse, triggering a homicide investigation. "This wasn't an accident," one emergency room doctor told detectives. "This was torture." The medical staff, accustomed to treating all manner of injuries, appeared visibly shaken by what they saw on the child's body. The case broke open when King agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, pleading guilty to third-degree murder in exchange for testimony against Batson. He admitted to hitting the boy, but described in detail how Batson inflicted daily assaults. "She would beat him every day," King told investigators, a statement that would later be read in court. This testimony, combined with neighbor accounts and forensic evidence, created an overwhelming case. Detectives recovered a blowtorch from the room, physical evidence that corroborated the burn patterns documented in the autopsy. In 2013, Nadera Batson sat expressionless in a Philadelphia courtroom as prosecutors displayed images of Jaquin's tortured body. One reporter noted she did not cry as those pictures appeared on screen. The jury found her guilty of third-degree murder and related child abuse charges. During sentencing, the judge addressed Batson directly. "What you did to this child was not discipline. It was not correction. It was torture, pure and simple." The judge sentenced her to 28 to 57 years in prison. King received 10 to 20 years for his role in the abuse and murder. The prosecutor called the case one of the most disturbing examples of child abuse the office had ever handled. As of 2025, both remain in Pennsylvania state prisons. Batson, now in her late 30s, has exhausted her appeals. Correctional records indicate she has maintained her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, refusing to participate in abuse-related rehabilitation programs. Jaquin's case raises disturbing questions about informal caregiving arrangements. How many children are placed with trusted godparents or friends without oversight, suffering behind closed doors? How many never make it to a courtroom at all? From Philadelphia, we move to Washington, D.C., where another godmother's betrayal would expose fatal flaws in a child welfare system that declared her home safe. This was a systems failure. The judge's words echo through a Washington, D.C. courtroom as he sentences Angela T. O'Brien for the murder of 23-month-old Brianna Blackmon. In January 2000, inside a Northwest Washington row house, the toddler suffered the kind of head trauma doctors normally see in high-speed car crashes. O'Brien, her godmother, told police she fell down the stairs. The medical evidence told a different story, one of violent impact far beyond what any household accident could explain. Angela T. O'Brien was more than just a roommate to Brianna's mother, who had struggled with addiction and housing instability. She was Brianna's godmother, the adult that child welfare authorities believed would help supervise after the toddler was returned to her biological mother's custody. The arrangement placed Brianna back with her mother in O'Brien's crowded row house, a home that sometimes housed up to 8 children. On paper, a judge had signed off on the placement as appropriate. In reality, the household was a pressure cooker of stress, inadequate supervision, and volatility that should have raised serious concerns. Born in 1998, Brianna had already experienced separation from her mother once before. Washington, D.C.'s child welfare system had previously removed her due to her mother's struggles with addiction. After a series of assessments and court hearings, the decision was made to reunify them, with O'Brien's home serving as the setting. What child welfare reports didn't fully account for were concerns about O'Brien's own history. Reports suggested her own children had previously been removed over abuse allegations. In later legislative hearings, officials would acknowledge that these red flags hadn't been adequately communicated between different parts of the system. The decision to return Brianna was made with incomplete information about the environment she was entering. During the final weeks of 1999 and the first days of 2000, Brianna lived in an environment that witnesses would later describe as chaotic and unpredictable. The row house was crowded, with children of various ages coming and going. Supervision was inconsistent. On January 6, 2000, according to court testimony, O'Brien became frustrated with Brianna's crying and behavior. An 11-year-old boy who lived in the house would eventually testify that his mother dropped the toddler twice and then instructed him and the other children to lie about what happened. She told us to say Brianna fell down the stairs, he explained during questioning. The medical evidence revealed that Brianna had been subjected to impacts powerful enough to cause catastrophic brain injuries, the kind that neurosurgeons testified were inconsistent with a simple fall. Brianna was rushed to Children's National Medical Center with severe head trauma. While O'Brien and others maintained the story about a fall downstairs, medical professionals immediately recognized the injuries didn't match that. Explanation: the pattern and severity of the trauma pointed to non-accidental impact, deliberate assault rather than an accident in a crowded house. These injuries are consistent with severe blunt force trauma, one doctor noted in the medical report that would later become evidence. They are not consistent with a fall down a typical residential staircase. Brianna never regained consciousness. The machines keeping her alive were disconnected after tests confirmed brain death. Detectives arriving at the row house quickly became suspicious. The staircase was short and the story felt rehearsed. There was a palpable tension among the children that investigators recognized from other abuse cases. Something's not right here, one detective would later testify about his initial impression. The breakthrough came during a forensic interview with O'Brien's 11-year-old son, who contradicted the full narrative. He described seeing his mother drop Brianna's head to the floor deliberately and then coaching him to stick to a cover story. Child psychologists who evaluated the boy's testimony found it credible. He provided details a child wouldn't know to fabricate, and his account remained consistent through multiple interviews. In 2001, Angela T. O'Brien stood trial in D.C. Superior Court charged with first-degree murder. The courtroom proceedings became a de facto examination not just of O'Brien's actions, but of the system that had approved Brianna's return to this living arrangement. Journalists packed the gallery, aware that the case had become a referendum on Washington, D.C.'s child welfare apparatus. The Washington Post ran a series on the case, highlighting the missed opportunities to protect Brianna and questioning how a child could be returned to a home with documented concerns about abuse. The jury rejected O'Brien's claim of an accidental fall, convicting her of second-degree murder and related charges. During sentencing, the judge delivered a scathing assessment. This tragedy was preventable at multiple levels. The system failed, but you, Ms. O'Brien, made the choice to harm this child. He sentenced her to 19 years to life in prison, calling the case a system failure that reflected broader problems with child protection services. Outside the courtroom, reporters noted that Brianna's death had already sparked internal reviews and promises of reform within DC's Child and Family Services Agency. Legislation nicknamed Brianna's Law was later introduced to strengthen oversight of child placements. As of 2025, Angela T. O'Brien remains in custody. Her most recent parole hearing resulted in denial, with the board citing her continued minimization of responsibility. Brianna's name lives on in policy reports and legislative hearings. Her death cited as a turning point that exposed critical gaps in monitoring children who are returned to caregivers in high-risk homes. Child welfare experts continue to reference the case when discussing the dangers of reunification without adequate follow-up support and monitoring. In Louisiana and Texas, another family would soon learn that even without system involvement, sending a child to visit a beloved godmother could end in unimaginable tragedy.
After the verdict was reached, Bernica Lott was sentenced to life without parole. Police walked her out of the courtroom, and as she walked onto the elevator, she hung her head in tears.
She was excited to visit her nana. 5-year-old Daviana Landry left Thibodaux, Louisiana, just after Father's Day 2020 for what was supposed to be a treat, a week-long stay in Orange, Texas, with her godmother, 32-year-old Bernica Lott. Daviana called her Nana, a term of endearment that reflected the trust and affection in their relationship. Family members later told reporters the child had been looking forward to the visit. Within days, that trust would be shattered forever. What began as an innocent summer visit would end with a child's death and a godmother facing capital murder charges. Bernica Lott held a position of significance in Daviana's life. As her godmother, She was considered family, trusted enough that Daviana's parents willingly sent their daughter across state lines to spend time with her. There was no history of child welfare involvement, no red flags that would have warned the family of danger. This was simply a normal arrangement between loved ones. In previous visits, Daviana had returned home happy and well cared for, reinforcing the family's confidence in Lot. She loved her nana, one relative told a local news station. That's all she talked about before leaving. Daviana was born in 2015, a child described by family as loving and full of personality. She came from a stable home in Thibodaux, Louisiana, where her parents maintained regular contact with Lot. The relationship had been positive enough that yearly visits had become routine. In June 2020, amid the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, Daviana traveled to Orange, Texas to spend a week with her godmother, a trip that had been planned as a special occasion after Father's Day. Photos from earlier visits showed a smiling child with her arm around her godmother. There was nothing in these images to suggest the violence that would follow. What happened in the days between June 24 and June 26, 2020 would later be described by prosecutors as a sustained assault. The medical examiner documented extensive blunt force trauma across Daviana's body, injuries so severe and widespread that accidental causes were ruled out almost immediately. The pattern, distribution, and severity of bruising indicated multiple impacts with significant force, consistent with a beating, not a fall or childhood mishap. The final injuries proved catastrophic, causing internal damage that led to her death. The injuries I observed, the medical examiner would later testify, are consistent with repeated, intentional, blunt force trauma inflicted over a short period of time. Autopsy photos revealed bruising in various stages, suggesting multiple incidents of abuse during Daviana's brief stay. On June 26, 2020, emergency responders answered a call to Lot's home in Orange, Texas. They found Daviana with severe injuries that could not be explained by the initial account Lot provided. She was transported to the hospital, but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. When medical staff examined her body, they recognized the telltale signs of non-accidental trauma, injuries that could not have occurred through normal childhood activities. One emergency room physician would later describe the scene as among the worst cases of child abuse he had witnessed in his career. The discrepancy between Lot's explanation and the medical findings immediately raised suspicions. The investigation focused immediately on Lot. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had access to Daviana during the critical period. The child's short stay in Texas effectively narrowed the field of potential perpetrators, and the nature of the injuries pointed directly to caregiver abuse. Orange police arrested Brenica Lot and charged her with capital murder, the most serious charge available under Texas law. The evidence tells us this was not an accident, the lead detective stated at a press conference. This was an intentional act of violence against a child. In media coverage following Daviana's death and Lot's arrest, family members shared photos of a smiling little girl with bright eyes, emphasizing that she was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a child who loved dancing and playing. Multiple outlets reported the family's shock and grief, noting repeatedly that Daviana had enjoyed previous visits with Nana and had been excited about this trip. "We never saw this coming," her mother told reporters through tears. "There were never any signs she wasn't safe with Brenica." The case went to trial in 2022. While capital murder charges in Texas can carry the death penalty, prosecutors announced they would not seek execution but instead pursue life without parole. The state presented medical experts who testified that Daviana's injuries required significant force applied multiple times, not a single accident or mishap. One pathologist explained that the injuries were comparable to those seen in car accidents or falls from significant heights, not typical household incidents. Despite defense attempts to suggest alternative explanations, the evidence of deliberate assault was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified that the pattern of injuries could not have been self-inflicted or caused by routine childhood accidents. The jury convicted Lott of capital murder. Because prosecutors had not sought the death penalty, the sentence was automatic: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brenica Lott was taken from the courtroom to begin serving a sentence that will, in all likelihood, end only with her death behind bars. During a victim impact statement, Daviana's father addressed Lott directly. "You were supposed to protect her. She loved you. We trusted you. How could you do this to a child who called you Nana?" For Daviana's family, the conviction brought legal closure, but emotional questions remained. They had to reconcile the Nana their daughter loved with the woman who beat her to death. How could a relationship warm enough for a child to invent an affectionate nickname turn lethal in less than a week? And if godparents could be so dangerous, what does safe even mean when we talk about family? In California, another trusted godparent relationship would end in tragedy at what should have been a perfectly innocent location, a public park.
For the baby's death in May of 2022. She says the two were friends with her daughter and would watch her daughter's kids from time to time.
Anybody who had an opportunity to meet Noah Kai knew how precious he was. When 9-month-old Noah Kai Talivar was taken to Abrams Park in Marina, California in May 2022 by his godparents, 26-year-old Marcus Aubrey Bering Hopkins and 23-year-old Tatiana Hale, his family had no reason for concern. Public parks are supposed to be safe places for children. Godparents are supposed to be protectors. Within hours, emergency responders would be rushing a critically injured infant to the hospital. He would not survive. The park outing that should have been a simple afternoon of fresh air and sunshine would become a crime scene investigation. For Noah Kai's parents and grandparents, he was described as a miracle child, precious, happy, and sweet. He was always smiling. His grandmother would later tell reporters, her voice breaking. His godparents were not strangers or casual acquaintances, but chosen family members who had been entrusted with his spiritual and physical well-being. If a godparent couldn't be trusted to safely supervise a baby at a playground, who could? The ceremony establishing Bering Hopkins and Hale as Noah Kai's godparents had been a joyous occasion, with photographs showing the couple holding the infant, their faces beaming with apparent pride in their new role. Born in 2021, Noah Kai came into a loving family that deliberately selected Bering Hopkins and Hale as his godparents, a role that traditionally carries significant responsibility for a child's upbringing and protection. The couple had been friends with Noah Kai's parents for several years before his birth, and there were no obvious warning signs about their behavior or temperament. By spring 2022, the relationship had progressed to the point where outings together were considered normal and beneficial. The trip to Abrams Park was meant to be a simple afternoon of fresh air and connection, another building block in what should have been a lifelong relationship of mentorship and care. What transpired during that May 2022 outing remains partially obscured in public records, but medical findings tell a clear story. At some point, Noah Kai suffered severe injuries that medical staff immediately identified as consistent with inflicted trauma, not an everyday accident or playground mishap. Internal bleeding, head trauma, and other injuries pointed to violent impact. There was no evidence of a car crash, no indication of a fall from significant height. The injury pattern suggested direct assault. These are not accidental injuries, one emergency room physician stated in documentation that would later become evidence. The pattern and severity indicate non-accidental trauma. Especially troubling was the presence of older bruises, suggesting this might not have been the first incident of abuse. Marina police were called when Noah Kai was brought to the emergency room with critical injuries. They immediately opened an investigation, reviewing the timeline and interviewing the godparents. About the circumstances, medical experts who examined Noah Kai's injuries recognized patterns consistent with those seen in other child abuse cases, trauma that could not be explained by the scenarios initially described by the caregivers. The explanation doesn't match the injuries, noted one medical report. Detectives carefully documented discrepancies in the accounts provided by Bering Hopkins and Hale, noting that their stories changed when confronted with medical evidence. In May 2022, authorities arrested Bering Hopkins and Hale, charging both with murder and child cruelty offenses. The fact that the victim was their godson added a layer of public outrage to the case. Local news coverage emphasized the betrayal aspect. Godparents accused of fatally injuring the child they had specifically promised to protect. They were supposed to be his spiritual guides, his protectors, the prosecutor would later say during a press conference. Instead, they inflicted injuries that ended his life. As the case moved through Monterey County's court system, details emerged in filings and hearings. Prosecutors emphasized the severity of Noakai's injuries, the responsibility the couple had as caregivers, and the absence of any plausible accidental explanation. The defense negotiated rather than proceeding to a full trial. Court records indicate that the prosecution had assembled substantial medical evidence that would have been difficult to counter in front of a jury. By 2025, both godparents had entered pleas. Bering Hopkins pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter and felony child abuse. Hale pleaded to lesser charges related to her role. The sentences fell far short of what an initial murder conviction might have carried. Bering Hopkins received 8 years, while Hale was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months. The plea agreement reduced the charges from murder to manslaughter, acknowledging the legal distinction between premeditated killing and a fatal loss of control, though this distinction offered little comfort to Noakai's family. During the sentencing, Noakai's family expressed that they did not feel they had received full justice for what happened to their baby. His grandmother told reporters that Noakai was really happy, really sweet, emphasizing the profound loss the family had suffered. 8 years is nothing compared to the lifetime we lost with him, she said outside the courthouse. For them, the legal classifications on the charging documents, manslaughter, child abuse, were less important than the simple reality that they had entrusted their child to godparents who did not bring him home alive. If a godparent can end a baby's life during a simple afternoon at a park, what does it reveal about the power we hand to people simply by calling them family? How thoroughly can we really know the people we entrust with our children's lives? In Cleveland, Ohio, another godmother and her husband would commit an even more deliberate act of concealment after allegedly abusing their godson to death. Underneath the soil in their backyard was the body of 4-year-old Eleazar Ruiz. What seemed like an ordinary yard in a Cleveland neighborhood concealed a horrifying secret. Beneath the grass and dirt lay the remains of a little boy who had been entrusted to his godmother's care. The discovery in January 2019 would lead to murder charges and a trial that exposed how completely a child could disappear when placed in an informal caregiving arrangement. Eleazar Ruiz's mother had allowed him to live with his godmother, Joanne Vega, and her husband, Romain Tolbert, in their house on West 80th Street. It was an informal arrangement many families make. Someone in the extended circle takes over care when a parent struggles. No paperwork, no official oversight, just a trusted friend stepping in to help. She was his godmother, someone we all trusted, a family member would later tell reporters. What happened inside that home over the next months would turn this arrangement into a crime scene. The child who entered their home would never be seen alive again. Born in 2013, Eleazar entered a life that would include periods of instability. His mother, facing personal challenges, arranged for him to stay with Vega and Tolbert, believing her son would receive proper care and stability in their home. This informal placement occurred without official oversight from child welfare agencies, a private arrangement between mother and godmother that left Eleazar vulnerable. There were no mandatory home visits, no caseworker checking on his well-being, no system to notice when he suddenly wasn't seen anymore. The relationship between Eleazar's mother and Vega had history. They had known each other for years, and the godmother role was seen as a natural extension of their connection. In 2017, something troubling occurred. Eleazar effectively disappeared from public view. There was no formal missing person report, no widely broadcast search. According to prosecutors, during this period, abuse occurred within the Vega-Tolbert household. At some point, the boy died. Rather than report his death, authorities alleged that Vega and Tolbert made a chilling decision. They buried Eleazar's body in their own backyard, hiding the evidence of what had happened to him. They didn't call 911, they didn't take him to a hospital, they buried him like garbage in their backyard, a prosecutor would later tell the jury. The medical examiner's report would document multiple injuries in various stages of healing, indicating a pattern of abuse before the fatal injuries. In January 2019, law enforcement discovered human remains behind the house. Forensic work confirmed they belonged to a child. Investigators connected the remains to Eleazar, who would have been about 4 years old at the time of his death. The grave was not deep or remote. He had been hidden in plain sight, just steps from the home where he should have been safe. Police photographs presented at trial showed a shallow grave that appeared hastily dug, with the child's remains wrapped in multiple layers of material. The location suggested not a panicked response to an accidental death, but a calculated decision to conceal evidence. Cleveland police and the FBI conducted an extensive investigation, working backward from the grim discovery to establish what had happened to Eleazar. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office filed serious charges: aggravated murder, felonious assault, endangering children, gross abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, kidnapping, and more. The charging documents painted a picture of abuse, failure to seek medical care, and deliberate concealment. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, the lead prosecutor explained in opening statements. This was sustained abuse followed by a deliberate cover-up. In 2020, the case went to trial. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence from the gravesite, along with testimony about Eleazar's treatment before his death. The autopsy findings described injuries inconsistent with accidents or natural causes. These injuries indicate multiple traumatic events, the medical examiner testified. They are not consistent with accidental falls or typical childhood injuries. The backyard burial became central to the prosecution's narrative, proof not just of a crime, but of an attempt to ensure no one would ever know the child was gone. The defense challenged aspects of the timeline and questioned who was responsible for what actions, but the combined weight of the forensic evidence and the burial narrative was substantial. Defense attorneys attempted to suggest that Eleazar might have died from natural causes or accidents, and that the burial was a panicked response rather than evidence of murder. This explanation failed to account for the multiple injuries documented by the medical examiner or the failure to seek medical attention when the child was still alive. The jury convicted both Vega and Tolbert on major charges related to Eleazar's death and the concealment of his body. During sentencing, the judge addressed both defendants directly. You were entrusted with this child's care, and instead of protecting him, you abused him and then treated his remains with utter disregard. Tolbert received a sentence of 15 years in prison. Vega was sentenced to 8 years. They were sent to Ohio State prisons to serve their terms. Tolbert's longer sentence reflected the court's assessment that he had played the more active role in the abuse that led to Eleazar's death. For the public, especially in Cleveland, the enduring image was stark and disturbing. A godmother and her husband, entrusted with a little boy, convicted in connection with his death and the decision to bury his body in their yard. Local news coverage emphasized how long the child had been missing before anyone in authority became aware, a gap that highlighted the vulnerability of children in informal placements. It raised a troubling question. What does it mean when someone is willing not only to harm a child, but to literally bury the evidence of his existence? And how many other informal placements exist where children simply disappear from view? In Las Vegas, another godmother would demonstrate that the most ordinary household objects can become deadly weapons in the hands of someone willing to use them. The medical examiner would later testify that the child had been beaten to death with a metal pipe. 13-month-old Dion Johnson could not understand what godmother meant. He knew only faces, voices, arms that picked him up. One of those faces belonged to Marianne Harris, his mother's friend and the woman honored with the title of godmother. On August 13, 2011, Diane was found dead in a Las Vegas apartment. Prosecutors would later allege Harris beat him to death, possibly with a section of metal pipe from a bar stool. The contrast between her ceremonial role and the brutality of her alleged actions shocked the community and raised questions about how we verify the character of those we designate as spiritual guardians for our children. The relationship began with trust. Harris, then 23, was close to Diane's mother and had stepped in to help with childcare. Over time, that help evolved into a more substantial caregiving role. Harris referred to herself as Diane's godmother, reinforcing the idea that she saw and wanted others to see this as a special bond, not just a babysitting arrangement. She was more than a babysitter, a family friend later told a reporter. She was someone who was supposed to be like a second mother to him. Photos recovered during the investigation showed Harris holding Diane at his christening ceremony, a formal acknowledgement of her special role in his life. Diane was born in 2010 in Las Vegas, Nevada. His early life included periods when his mother relied on her friend Marianne Harris for support and childcare. The arrangement was informal, but based on friendship and trust. There are no public records suggesting previous concerns about Harris's caregiving, and she moved between Nevada and California during this period, maintaining the relationship with Diane's family. The pattern was familiar. A young single mother getting help from a friend, that friendship evolving into a quasi-familial relationship formalized with the title godmother. On August 13, 2011, the situation turned tragic. Emergency responders were called to an apartment in the central Las Vegas Valley where they found Diane unresponsive. One officer later noted that the child appeared to have been dead for some time before anyone called 911, a delay that suggested not panic but hesitation or possibly calculation. Medical personnel could not revive him. The scene immediately raised concerns among first responders. Something wasn't right, one paramedic would later testify. The explanation we were given didn't match what we were seeing. The autopsy findings were devastating. Medical examiners documented multiple injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. Prosecutors alleged that Harris had beaten the toddler with a section of metal pipe, possibly from a bar stool. The force of the blows caused fatal internal damage. This was not a case of a child falling or having an accident. The pattern of injuries indicated deliberate, powerful impacts. The injuries I observed, the medical examiner would testify, are consistent with multiple blows from a rigid cylindrical object. Photos shown in court documented bruising patterns that matched the diameter and shape of the metal pipe recovered from the apartment. Harris was not in Nevada when police sought to question her about Diane's death. She was arrested in California and extradited back to face charges in Clark County. Authorities charged her with murder and child abuse with a deadly weapon, setting the stage for what would become a high-profile case focused on the betrayal of trust by a godparent. Police investigators described finding the apartment in disarray, with evidence suggesting Harris had left hurriedly after Diane's death. Her quick departure to California added to the prosecution's argument that her actions showed consciousness of guilt. Local news coverage emphasized the relationship between victim and perpetrator. One report noted that prosecutors claimed Harris beat to death the child she was godmother to, a phrase that cut through any ambiguity about what authorities believed had happened in that Las Vegas apartment. The contrast between the ceremonial role of godmother and the brutal reality of Diane's injuries became central to the narrative. This wasn't just child abuse, the prosecutor told jurors in opening statements. This was a complete betrayal of the most sacred trust. At trial in 2013, prosecutors presented the medical evidence, the timeline of events, and Harris's movements between Nevada and California. They highlighted the delay in calling for emergency assistance, the severity of the injuries, and the mismatch between the supposed protective role of a godmother and the reality of what happened to Diane. Multiple witnesses testified about Harris's relationship with Diane and his mother, establishing that she was not just an occasional babysitter, but someone who had accepted a formal role in the child's life. The defense raised questions about exactly how the injuries occurred, but without a credible accidental mechanism to explain the trauma, their position was weak. The metal pipe, matched to the pattern of Diane's injuries, became a powerful piece of physical evidence linking Harris to the killing. The jury found Harris guilty of first-degree murder and multiple counts of child abuse. During sentencing, the judge addressed her directly. "You were chosen to be this child's spiritual guide and protector. Instead, you became his killer." She was sentenced to decades in Nevada State Prison, a term that will consume most of her adult life. As of 2025, she remains incarcerated, with decades still to serve before any possibility of release. Her appeals have been unsuccessful, with courts upholding both the conviction and the lengthy sentence. For those who heard about the case, the phrase fairy godmother took on a bitter irony. The archetype is of a woman with a wand and a promise, someone who steps in to protect and uplift. In that Las Vegas apartment in August 2011, the godmother's tool was not a wand, but allegedly a pipe. When a title associated with blessing and protection becomes attached to homicide, it raises an uncomfortable question. Does granting someone ceremonial status blind us to warning signs we might otherwise see? In New York in the early 1990s, a different godmother's household would hide a quieter, longer horror, a case that would eventually capture national attention for reasons beyond the abuse itself. Before Katie Beers became headline news as a kidnapped child found alive in an underground bunker, she was already living in what she would later describe as hell. In the early 1990s, before she became known nationwide as the girl rescued from a Long Island dungeon, Katie Beers was a quiet, neglected child shuttled between adults who either could not or would not protect her. Her story would eventually capture America's attention because of her dramatic rescue, but the years of abuse that preceded her kidnapping represented a different kind of tragedy, one that unfolded not in a secret bunker but in the home of her godmother. One of those adults was her godmother, Linda Inkeleri. Another was Linda's husband, Salvatore. While the world would come to know Katie through the dramatic story of her kidnapping and rescue, the quieter horror was what happened inside her godmother's home for years before that abduction ever took place. Court records, interviews, and Katie's own memoir document a childhood marked by neglect, exploitation, and sexual abuse, much of it occurring while she was supposedly under the protection of her godmother. Born in 1982 on Long Island, New York, Katie experienced instability from her earliest years. Her mother struggled with personal issues and often left Katie in the Inkeleri household. On paper, it looked like a safety net, a godmother stepping in to provide a home, meals, and supervision. For a child in chaos, it might have seemed like stability. "I thought that's just how life was," Katie would later write in her memoir. "I didn't know children were supposed to be treated differently." School records from the time show a quiet child with inconsistent attendance and few close connections to peers, signs that, in retrospect, suggested a troubled home life that crossed multiple households. Inside the Inkeleri house, according to later court records and Katie's own memoir, Buried Memories, the reality was far different. Salvatore sexually abused her repeatedly. Linda, the godmother who should have been her protector, failed to intervene. She knew, Katie would later state flatly in interviews. The godmother's home was not a refuge, but a place where abuse became routine, where Katie's vulnerability was exploited rather than shielded. Daily life included not just sexual abuse, but also what Katie described as constant work. Being treated more like a servant than a child, expected to handle adult responsibilities while being denied normal childhood experiences like proper schooling and play. The pattern continued for years. While there were occasional interactions with social services, the full extent of what happened in the Inkeleri home remained hidden. Katie later described feeling trapped and unheard, with no effective way to communicate what was happening to her. The abuse wasn't a single incident, but a sustained pattern that shaped her childhood. Medical records and school reports from the time contain hints of what was happening. unexplained injuries, behavioral issues, emotional withdrawal, but these signals were not connected into a coherent picture until much later. Even when Katie attempted to communicate her situation to adults outside the home, she lacked the vocabulary and support to make herself understood. In December 1992, another predator entered Katie's life. Family friend John Esposito kidnapped her and held her in a secret underground bunker for 17 days. When she was found alive on January 13, 1993, her story shocked the nation. Media coverage focused on the dungeon-like chamber Esposito had built beneath his home, the narrow space where the 10-year-old had been kept, and the remarkable fact that she had survived. The images were dramatic. Police officers opening the hidden trapdoor, the small concrete room where Katie had been imprisoned, the complex locking system Esposito had constructed to prevent escape. What received less attention initially but became crucial to understanding the full scope of betrayal was what Katie revealed about her life before the abduction. During interviews with investigators and later in her memoir, she described physical and sexual abuse in the Inkeleri household. She explained that the man who assaulted her was not a stranger, but her godmother's husband, someone who should have been trustworthy. He would come into my room at night, she disclosed during forensic interviews. The details she provided were specific and consistent, matching patterns known to investigators who specialized in child sexual abuse cases. Investigators working the Beers kidnapping case in 1992-1993 did not stop with Esposito's crimes. As they spoke with Katie, they learned about what had happened in Linda and Salvatore's home. They opened a separate investigation focused on these allegations. Salvatore was charged with sexual offenses against Katie and ultimately pleaded guilty, confirming that the horrors she described were not imagination but criminal acts recognized by the court. Court transcripts show that when confronted with specific details provided by Katie, Salvatore could not maintain his denials. His guilty plea spared Katie the additional trauma of testifying against him in court. Linda's role was legally more complex. While not directly perpetrating the sexual assaults, she was the adult godmother in the house. The person who should have protected Katie noticed signs of abuse and believed her if she spoke up. Instead, according to Katie's account, the abuse continued under Linda's roof, with her knowledge, or at least her willful blindness. She chose him over me, Katie would later say simply. While Linda faced lesser legal consequences than her husband, the moral failure was profound. A godmother who abdicated the fundamental responsibility to protect a child in her care. For Katie, the aftermath has been a lifetime of processing trauma. In interviews as an adult, she has spoken openly about how the Ingeleri home affected her, saying that in some ways the long-term abuse there was harder to overcome than the time spent in Esposito's bunker. The bunker was a visible, physical horror, something concrete. The betrayal in the godmother's home was more abstract, but no less damaging. The bunker was terrible, she told one interviewer, but at least there I understood what was happening. Before that, I thought maybe that's just how life was supposed to be. Salvatore served prison time for his crimes against Katie. Linda moved through life carrying the weight of what happened under her care. The case eventually faded from headlines, but it remains documented in court records and in Katie's own telling of her story. As of 2025, Katie Beers continues to speak about childhood trauma and has built a life that includes advocacy for abuse survivors. Her story has been featured in documentaries and news retrospectives that examine not just the dramatic rescue, but the systemic failures that allowed years of abuse to continue in what should have been a safe home. This story complicates any simple narrative about monsters and victims. The godmother was not a cartoon villain wielding a weapon or burying a body. She was an adult who allowed abuse to happen under her roof, who failed to act as a shield for a vulnerable child placed in her care. It raises a question that extends beyond this case. Is evil only in the hand that strikes, or also in the eyes that look away? In Texas, 2 women would take a different approach with a child placed in their care, a case that would redefine what kidnapping looks like in the modern era. For nearly 8 years, a missing child lived under a different identity, hidden in plain sight. In 2004, in Houston, Texas, an 8-month-old baby named Miguel was left with a babysitter. She was someone his parents knew, someone who had watched their child before. Her name was Crystal Tanner. When the time came for Miguel to go home, he didn't. What followed was not a dramatic abduction at gunpoint, but something more insidious, the slow transformation of a babysitting arrangement into kidnapping, with a child's entire identity erased and rewritten. According to court documents and later reporting, Tanner claimed that Miguel's mother, who was struggling with difficult life circumstances, had effectively given the baby to her. The mother said otherwise. What is clear is that Miguel disappeared from his biological family's life. No Amber Alert was issued. The case did not become a high-profile missing child investigation. Instead, his absence was swallowed by the bureaucratic gaps that sometimes envelop marginalized families. Initial police reports classified the case as a custody dispute, rather than a kidnapping, a critical error that delayed serious investigation for years. The system failed this child completely. One prosecutor would later state, he literally fell through the cracks. Miguel was born in 2003 in Houston, Texas. His early months were spent with his biological family, who occasionally relied on Tanner for babysitting. The exact nature of Tanner's relationship with Miguel's mother is documented differently by different sources, but functionally, she occupied a role similar to that of a godparent or extended family member, someone outside the immediate nuclear family who helps with childcare and is trusted with access to the child. Photographs from that time show Miguel as a healthy, smiling baby, unaware of how completely his life was about to change. For nearly 8 years after his disappearance, Miguel lived under a different identity. Tanner, and later her mother, Gloria Walker, moved him around East Texas, raising him as their own child. Neighbors in places like San Augustine County knew the boy by another name. They saw a child growing up, not a kidnapping victim. He attended school, interacted with the community, and lived a life completely disconnected from his biological family and legal identity. School records from that period show a child registered under a different name, with no documentation connecting him to his birth family. When questioned by occasional social services visits, Tanner and Walker created elaborate explanations for the lack of official records. The abuse in this case took different forms from the physical violence seen in other godparent cases. Court records documented neglect, educational deprivation, and psychological manipulation. Miguel was raised to believe he belonged to a family that had, in reality, taken him. His biological family was denied the opportunity to raise him, to see him grow, to know him during his formative years. The harm was both to Miguel himself and to those who searched for him. They stole his identity. His biological mother would later tell reporters through tears, "They stole years we can never get back." In 2012, a combination of tips and administrative discrepancies triggered an investigation. Authorities in East Texas began to suspect that a boy living with Tanner and Walker might not be who they claimed he was. School officials had raised questions about the lack of proper documentation. Local child welfare workers noticed inconsistencies in the stories Tanner and Walker told about the child's background. DNA testing was ordered. When the results came back, they confirmed what Miguel's biological family had believed all along. The child in that rural home was their missing son. The scientific certainty of the DNA match cut through years of confusion and misclassification, finally establishing the truth of what had happened. The reunion was visually dramatic, an 8-year-old boy meeting his family after a disappearance that had consumed most of his life. But the emotional complexity was profound. Miguel had to process the revelation that the women who had raised him were being led away in handcuffs, charged with kidnapping and injury to a child, while strangers, who were legally his family, claimed him with genuine love and legal right. Psychologists who worked with him during the transition noted the exceptional challenges of helping a child whose entire understanding of his identity had been built on a foundation of deception. At trial in 2013, the state laid out the narrative. A child taken under the cover of caregiving, moved between homes, subjected to neglect and injury, and denied contact with his biological family. Prosecutors presented evidence of the deliberate steps Tanner and Walker had taken to conceal Miguel's identity, using different names in different communities, avoiding situations that required legal documentation, and creating fictional explanations for his background. Tanner was convicted of kidnapping and injury to a child, receiving a 99-year sentence for kidnapping plus an additional 8 years for injury. Walker was convicted as well, receiving a 30-year sentence and additional time for related charges. Both women were sent to Texas state prisons, where they remain as of 2025. Appeals filed by both defendants have been unsuccessful, with courts upholding the convictions and sentences. In court, a prosecutor captured the essence of their crime with a phrase that was repeated in media summaries. Miguel was hidden in plain sight. This case represented the inverse of a backyard burial. The child was alive, visible, and interacting with the world, but his true identity was buried beneath a fabricated life. The women who took him exploited the trust placed in caregivers, using it as a gateway to claim a child as their own. For Miguel's biological family, the years of searching had ended with a bittersweet reunion, joy at finding their son alive, but grief for the time lost and a relationship that would need to be rebuilt from scratch. The Tanner Walker case expands our understanding of how godparents and quasi-kin can betray trust. Not all such betrayals end in a child's death or physical injury. Sometimes the betrayal lies in the systematic erasure of a child's true identity and connections, raising troubling questions about how easily children can disappear when transferred through informal caregiving arrangements. As one detective involved in the case noted, if someone is determined enough, they can make a child vanish not by hiding them, but by hiding who they really are. There are other godparents whose crimes don't involve physical custody at all, but instead involve repeated violations of another boundary, a child's bodily autonomy. In Waco, Texas, one godfather's abuse was so sustained that prosecutors used a special legal category created specifically for such situations. The statute continuous sexual abuse of a child exists for cases where the harm is not a single act, but a pattern. In McLennan County, Texas, this charge was brought against Julio Arellano Alvarez. He was not a stranger lurking in shadows, but a godfather and family figure, someone his goddaughter knew well and was expected to trust. His case demonstrates how the intimate access granted to godparents can become a pathway for sustained exploitation, with a child's spiritual guide becoming her worst nightmare. Beginning around 2018, according to trial testimony and appellate records, Arellano Alvarez used that trust and the access it provided to sexually assault his goddaughter repeatedly. The specific acts are not detailed here out of respect for the victim, but court records confirm they were severe enough to meet Texas's strict legal definition of sexual abuse, occurring multiple times over a period exceeding 30 days. The abuse took place in locations where a godfather's presence would not raise suspicions: family gatherings, overnight stays, outings that appeared appropriate on the surface but created opportunities for isolation and assault. Arellano Alvarez had been chosen as a godfather, a position traditionally meant to provide spiritual guidance and additional support to a child. Instead, he exploited the privileges that came with this trusted role, access to the child, time alone, and the presumption by others that his interest was protective rather than predatory. Family photographs shown during the trial depicted him at the child's religious ceremonies, standing proudly beside her parents in church, embodying the very role he would later betray so profoundly. Born in the mid-2000s, the victim grew up knowing Arellano Alvarez as her godfather. The relationship between her family and Arellano Alvarez was close enough that he had regular, unsupervised access to her, a common arrangement in many families with godparents. This access created opportunities for abuse that began when she was under 14 years old, the threshold age specified in Texas's continuous sexual abuse statute. What made the betrayal especially damaging was the child's understanding of what a godfather was supposed to be, someone chosen by her parents to guide and protect her, not harm her. The pattern continued for an extended period. Unlike some abuse cases where a single incident leads immediately to disclosure, this situation involved repeated violations over time. The home, bedroom, and spaces that should have been safe for the child became places of fear and trauma. The godfather's position gave him not just physical access, but also psychological leverage, the ability to normalize the abuse and discourage disclosure. He told her this was normal, a prosecutor would later explain to the jury. He told her this was what godfathers were supposed to do. This manipulation of the child's understanding of the godparent role added an additional layer of betrayal to the physical violations. As in many child sexual abuse cases, the breaking point came not from forensic evidence in the classic sense, but from the victim finding her voice. She eventually told someone what had been happening. That disclosure led to a forensic interview where trained professionals spoke with her in a controlled environment, asking open-ended questions designed to elicit truth without suggestion or leading. The video recording of this interview would later become central evidence in the case, allowing jurors to hear directly from the victim about the nature and frequency of the abuse without requiring her to testify repeatedly in court. Investigators corroborated what they could. Timelines, who was present in the home when, any physical findings that aligned with her account. They spoke with family members and assessed the dynamics between the child and the godfather. Piece by piece, they built a case that relied primarily on the victim's testimony but was supported by circumstantial evidence and the internal consistency of her account. Digital evidence from phones and computers provided additional corroboration of the opportunities for abuse, showing patterns of communication and visits that matched the victim's description of when and where the assaults occurred. In early 2024, Arellano Alvarez stood trial in a Texas courtroom, charged with continuous sexual abuse of a child. The prosecution's case hinged largely on the victim's testimony, with supporting evidence about opportunity and access. The defense challenged credibility, as is common in such cases, but Texas juries are familiar with the pattern of delayed disclosure and secrecy that often characterizes intrafamilial abuse. Expert witnesses explained the dynamics of child sexual abuse, including the reasons children often delay reporting and the specific vulnerabilities created by relationships of trust and authority. The jury believed the victim. They returned a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Arellano Alvarez to 35 years in prison, a term long enough that, for much of his remaining life, his world will be measured in yards of concrete and steel rather than freedom. During sentencing, the judge addressed him directly. You were chosen to guide this child spiritually. Instead, you violated her in the most fundamental way possible. The betrayal is complete. He appealed the conviction, as is his right. In 2025, an appellate court reviewed the trial record and upheld both the conviction and sentence, rejecting arguments about evidentiary sufficiency and procedure. The legal system affirmed that, in its view, the abuse happened as described, and that the godfather had used his role to facilitate it. The written appellate opinion noted specifically that the victim's testimony was credible, detailed, and internally consistent, meeting all the standards required under Texas law for a conviction on this serious charge. This case raises different questions than those involving fatal beatings or secret burials. There is no autopsy photo, no crime scene tape. The harm is in what was taken from a child over time: safety, bodily autonomy, the ability to trust those who should protect her. When the person doing the taking is a godfather, a man chosen to stand beside parents at religious or ceremonial moments, promising spiritual guidance and moral support, the betrayal cuts especially deep. As one family member stated during the victim impact phase of the trial, when we chose you as godfather, we thought we were giving her an additional protector. Instead, we gave her to her abuser. In France, another godfather would face allegations of violating the trust placed in him, but in circumstances that would connect to broader cultural reckonings about power and abuse in the film industry. In a criminal courtroom outside Paris, one of France's most powerful film executives sits at the defendant's table, charged with sexually assaulting his godson. Dominique Boutonat was not the kind of person most viewers expect to see in a compilation of most evil godparents. He was a polished figure in a suit, a film producer and wealthy investor. In 2019, he was appointed head of France's National Centre for Cinema and the Moving Image, CNC, the powerful state body that finances and regulates large parts of the French film industry. His case would become emblematic of how godparent abuse crosses all social and economic boundaries, occurring even among society's most privileged members. On paper, he was a gatekeeper of culture, a man tasked in part with promoting and protecting the arts. He was also a godfather to a young man who would eventually accuse him of sexual assault during a holiday in the south of France. The allegations would lead to a criminal trial that unfolded against the backdrop of the film industry's broader reckoning with sexual misconduct, adding layers of cultural and political complexity to what was, at its core, a case about violated trust between a godfather and godson. Boutonat's position in French cultural circles was substantial. As head of the CNC, he controlled significant funding for film production and influenced which projects moved forward. His appointment in 2019 had been a high-profile affair, establishing him as a central figure in an industry that was simultaneously grappling with its own that was Me Too movement, known in France as Balance ton porc, expose your pig. Before taking the helm at the CNC, he had produced several successful films and developed a reputation as a savvy investor in the French entertainment sector. His connections extended into political circles, with supporters in the highest levels of government who had championed his appointment to the prestigious position. In August 2020, according to court documents and French press coverage, Boutonat invited his godson, then in his early 20s, on holiday to his villa in the south of France. There was a history of financial and professional support in the relationship. The godson had received help from his godfather, creating lines that blurred the boundaries between family, mentorship, and patronage. The young man had artistic aspirations of his own, and Boutonat had positioned himself as a guide and mentor in addition to his ceremonial role as godfather. This dynamic created multiple layers of power imbalance, spiritual, financial, and professional, that would later become central to the case against him. What happened during that holiday became the subject of a criminal case that would not conclude for nearly 4 years. The godson later filed a formal complaint alleging that Boutonat sexually assaulted him and attempted to rape him while he was vulnerable, reportedly after drinking and at times when he was asleep or half awake. The allegations were specific and detailed acts that French law categorizes as sexual assault and attempted rape. In his complaint, the godson described waking to find Boutonat touching him inappropriately, feeling confused and trapped by both his physical state and the complex relationship between them, and ultimately being able to resist a more serious assault. Court documents indicate he provided detailed descriptions of the villa's interior, the room where the alleged assault occurred, and the sequence of events. In 2020, French police placed Boutonat in custody for questioning about the allegations. In February 2021, he was formally charged. Throughout the process, he maintained his innocence, denying that any non-consensual sexual contact had occurred. His defense team characterized the relationship as affectionate but appropriate, suggesting the godson had misinterpreted certain actions or fabricated allegations. For a time after the charges were filed, he remained in his position at the CNC, a decision that drew criticism from activists and members of the film community who argued that someone under investigation for sexual violence, especially against a godson, should not continue to lead an institution with significant power in the industry. Petitions circulated calling for his suspension pending the outcome of the case, and several prominent filmmakers spoke out about the message his continued leadership sent to potential victims within the industry. The case moved slowly through the French judicial system. In 2022, prosecutors decided to send it to a correctional court rather than an assize court, meaning the charge would be sexual assault rather than rape. This procedural decision shaped the possible outcomes, but did not diminish the seriousness of the allegations. Legal experts noted that the distinction in French law between these categories is based on specific definitions of the acts involved, not on their severity or impact on the victim. The reclassification meant a different trial process and potential sentencing range, but still involved allegations of serious sexual misconduct. In June 2024, the trial began at a courthouse near Paris. French media described a tense courtroom atmosphere as the godson testified about what he said happened in August 2020, about waking to find his godfather touching him, about the confusion and fear that followed. "I trusted him completely," he told the court, according to reports. "He was my godfather, someone I looked up to." Boutinat's defense team challenged the victim's credibility, suggested ulterior motives, and pointed to what they characterized as inconsistencies in his account. They framed the relationship as affectionate but not abusive. Character witnesses testified about Boutinat's professional reputation and personal integrity, while psychological experts called by the prosecution discussed the dynamics of power and trust that can enable abuse within family-like relationships. The judges evaluating the case faced a difficult task, determining whose account was more plausible in a situation with no external witnesses to the key events. There was no DNA evidence that could conclusively resolve the competing narratives. What existed was a pattern of messages, the context of the holiday, and the inherent power imbalance in a relationship where one man held significant financial and institutional influence over his godson. The court heard testimony about the godson's behavior after the alleged assault, including contemporaneous messages to friends that alluded to something troubling having occurred, providing some external corroboration for his claim that something had happened during the holiday. On June 26, 2024, the court delivered its verdict. Boutinat was acquitted of attempted rape, but found guilty of sexual assault against his godson. The court determined that while the evidence didn't support the most serious charge, it did establish beyond reasonable doubt that non-consensual sexual contact had occurred in the context of a relationship where the godson was particularly vulnerable due to the multiple dimensions of trust and authority involved. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with 1 year to be served immediately and 2 years suspended. Additionally, he was ordered to register as a sex offender and would face ongoing supervision. Shortly after the verdict, Boutinat resigned from his position as head of the CNC, ending a tenure that had become increasingly controversial as the case progressed. For supporters of the godson, the conviction represented vindication, proof that a powerful man could be held accountable for violating someone who had trusted him. "This shows that no one is above the law," the godson's lawyer stated outside the courthouse, "not even those who control the cultural institutions." For others in the French film industry, it stood as a troubling symbol of how deeply problems of power abuse ran, even among those tasked with overseeing cultural institutions in the post-Revolt Me Too era. Several industry organizations released statements acknowledging the verdict and calling for structural changes to better protect vulnerable people within the arts. Unlike the other cases in this documentary, this one did not involve a child victim or result in homicide. The godson was an adult at the time of the assault, but the core theme remained consistent. A godparent used the unique intimacy and authority of that role to cross boundaries in a way that caused lasting harm. In her written decision, the presiding judge specifically noted the special significance of the godfather relationship, stating that the spiritual and familial nature of this bond created a particular obligation of trust and protection, which the defendant violated. The case raised a final difficult question. If even the institutions meant to fund and celebrate stories about justice and abuse could be led by someone convicted of assaulting his godson, How pervasive might the problem really be? And what does it tell us about the special vulnerabilities that exist in relationships defined by tradition and trust? The Boutinard case, unfolding in the rarefied air of the French cultural elite, demonstrated that the dynamics of godparent abuse transcend class, education, and social position, occurring in contexts ranging from cramped boarding houses to luxurious Mediterranean villas. There is a thread running through every story you've heard tonight, whether it unfolds in a boarding house in Philadelphia, a cramped DC row home, a sunny park in California, or a villa in the south of France. The people who did the harm were not strangers. They were godmothers and godfathers, babysitters turned quasi-kin, friends bestowed with titles at ceremonies meant to mark love and protection. They were the ones who held babies at baptisms, who posed for photos, who promised to step in if anything ever happened to the parents. Sometimes they killed with fists or pipes or sustained torture. Sometimes they killed more slowly, with years of sexual abuse or the theft of identity. In every case, they weaponized a role that should have been sacred. For some, that decision was driven by desperation, homelessness, addiction, poverty. For others, it was the natural instinct to share a beloved child with a beloved friend. In most families, that instinct is rewarded. The godparent becomes an ally, a support, sometimes a lifesaver. But in these 10 cases, it became a vector for horror. Remember the names of the children, not just the adults who harmed them. Remember that titles mean nothing without character to back them up. And remember that evil does not always come in the form of a stranger in the night. Sometimes it wears the outfit of a godparent at a christening, smiling for the camera, already holding too much power. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Which of these godparents do you think committed the most disturbing betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below.